Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Lawson, and this is grecochess, my chess YouTube channel. We'll continue now with the QCC Summer Swiss tournament. In the previous video, I showed to you the game I played in round number 1, where I drew with a much higher rated player. In fact, he was the third highest rated player of the tournament. We'll see now what happened in the second round. But first, let me share with you once again the location. This beautiful church that you see here. And now let's share once again the announcement. QCC Summer G45 Swiss, hosted by the Queen's Chess Club, takes place on 2 days, June 20th, that was yesterday, and June 27th, next Friday, 2 rounds each night, with the time control being G45, D5, meaning when the players start, they have 45 minutes on their clock. When it's their turn to play for the first 5 seconds, clock does not move, and then it starts going downwards, and players need to complete all their moves before time goes down to 0. My opponent now. If in the previous round I faced the third highest rated player of the tournament, now I had to face the second highest rated player of the tournament. A name some of you may remember, Brian Lawson. I had faced him about a month ago in the same club in the previous tournament. His rating then was 2003, now it is 2014. Expected to go 2027 on July 1st. And he's in the 97.2 percentile. Compare this with my numbers. Rating of 1554, expected to go up a little bit to 1560 by July 1st. And I'm in the 85.6 percentile. As you may see, the odds are heavily against me. It would take almost a miracle for me to win or even to get a draw, but let's see what happened. Brian has the black pieces, I have the white pieces like last time. Once again, you'll see on the right the computer analysis. Plus means that white has advantage, minus means that black has advantage. The computer will tell every move if it's the best one or not. If not, it will suggest the best one, and then it's going to show the evaluation and what the evaluation would be if the other side would play one of the top 3 moves. Like last time, I started with my pawn, pawn from e2 to e4, he played his pawn to e6, I play my pawn to d4, and he plays his pawn to d5. At the last time, I had moved my bishop from f1 to d3 for move number 3, but since I lost the time, I said, let's play another way. At least let's send something different. And I played what is called the advanced French variation, by pushing my pawn from e4 to e5, and by doing so, I control more of the board, and in addition, I control the square f6. He cannot put his knight there. He has to think of another square to put his knight. He replies by pushing his pawn from c7 to c5 and taking control of the queen side of the board. Not control, but I would say having more coverage. I reply by moving my c-pawns from c2 to c3, and he pushes his knight to c6. I develop my knight to f3. He develops his knight to e7, since the f6 square is not available any longer. Till now, 5 moves, all of them are book moves, which means they have been analyzed in theory, and they're called book moves because even complete books, volumes have been written just about this series of moves. Move number 6, bishop goes to b5. Computer says it's inaccuracy. But I'm pinning his knight, but he unpins his knight with the bishop going to d7. And until now, we are more or less even, have a very small advantage. Move number 7, a mistake. I played it because in general, develop as many of your pieces as possible in the castle. Why not? But there is a little detail that had escaped me, that I had missed, and you're going to see why this was a mistake. I realized it immediately when Brian played his move. He moved his knight from c6 to e5, and then I saw it. I'm losing a pawn no matter what. If I take back his knight, whether with my knight or with a pawn, he takes my bishop. If I take his bishop and I check with my bishop from b5 to d7, he takes it back with his knight, which is not attacked any longer, and he's up a pawn. Of course, if I use my pawn to take his pawn, he takes. Then the best thing he can do a lot of things is take my knight with a check, and if I take back, he takes my bishop. I lose even more. No matter what I do, I'm down at least a pawn. Minimize damage. I decided to take his knight to have my knight in the center of the board and control the f7 square. Computer doesn't like it, thinks I'd rather check first. And as expected, he takes my bishop. My rook goes to e1 because now my rook was attacked by his bishop and I lost a pawn. I don't want to lose an exchange. In addition to that, rook goes to e1. I started daydreaming about the square f7. My knight is attacking it. If only I could put my queen either to f3 or to h5, double attack there, he would have to think of something to do to stop my attack. But he doesn't even let me entertain such daydreams for too long. He sent his knight from e7 to g6. And you may be wondering, why did he allow me to create double pawns? Because if I take his knight and he takes it back, whether with the f or the h pawn, he has double pawns, which is usually bad, but this time he'll use the h pawn. His queen will soon land on h4. And the h file is open. He can push his... and then my h2 pawn is in danger. Of course, I can perhaps delay it by pushing my pawn from g2 to g3, but then my light-colored squares are very weak in front of my king. That's why I'm not exchanging the knights, and instead I'm taking the bishop at b5, which he defends it by sending his bishop to c6. I take his bishop, so now he doesn't have the bishop pair any longer. Takes it back with his pawn, and I have been able to do the following. First of all, he doesn't have the bishop pair any longer. His c pawns are doubled, and he has two instead of one pawn islands. These are nice advantages to have, but not when you dump your material. My queen goes to a4 to attack his pawn at c6, which is isolated, has no pawn to defend it. He defends it with his queen that goes to d7. And I decide to attack his pawn at c5 a second time, meaning if I could play a second time in a row, my d pawn would take his c pawn and he could not take it back with his bishop. That is why he takes my d4 with his pawn. I have to take the pawn back. The computer would rather have me take it back with my pawn, but then my pawn becomes isolated and my bishop is blocked. That's why I take it back with my bishop. Computer would rather have me, if not with a pawn, even with a queen at d4. I took it back with my bishop because I freeze his bishop at f8, because if he moves it, the g7 pawn is lost. The computer doesn't like this move at all, considers it a mistake, and from being 1 point something down, I'm now 3.13. He attacks my bishop with his c pawn. And now I need to think, because if I move my bishop, I lose my queen. If I move my queen, I lose my bishop. The only move that doesn't lose me more material is exchange of queens. And he doesn't have the castling option any longer. Well, now that we are near the ending, that's not so important. Queens are not on the board, and kings will soon need to be activated. But let's first set my bishop, send it to e5, which is nice. I have my bishop at the center of the board. It's in the big dark colored diagonal that goes from A1 to H8, and in addition controls all of the squares of the second biggest dark colored diagonal that goes from H2 to B8. That's why Brian doesn't want me to entertain these dreams for too long. Takes my bishop, I take it with my rook. And then he sends his rook to E8, to B8. Now he threatens my pawn at B2. Two ways to save it. Either push my pawn to B3 or my rook from E5 goes to E2. I didn't like pushing my pawn, even though the computer thinks it's the best, because this would weaken my pawn at C3. And Brian doesn't need too much to attack it. All he needs to do is pawn goes to G6, bishop to G7. I need to move my rook. And for the time being, the knight may protect the pawn, but then my knight is frozen on B1. Knight cannot move, and neither can my rook on A1. That's why I decided to save my pawn by moving my E-rook to E2. His bishop goes to E7, and I knew why. He's planning to double his rooks on the B5. Fortunately, he has a few moves to do. It cannot be done immediately. He needs at least 2 moves, and that gives me just enough time to put my rook on C2 so I can later place my knight on D2 without losing the pawn, because if I did it immediately, I would lose the B2 pawn. His rook goes to B7, and I knew why. Next move, his rook goes to B8. My knight goes to D2. Finally, it's free to leave its starting position. His rook goes to B8, and I protect my pawn by placing my rook to B1. At this time, my pawn at B2 is safe, but this means that I have 2 rooks that are frozen on their squares. Brian decides to start pushing his A pawn, goes to A5. Currently, whether at A7 or A5 can do nothing, but if I let it free, eventually it will land on A3 and attack my pawn on B3. I might have to push my pawn to B3, for example, then I weaken my C3 pawn. But what I want to do is, first of all, make my knight on D2 more active, and my rook on C2. My knight will go to F3 because more active controls the square at E5. And in addition, my rook on C2 can go to D2 or E2 without losing my pawn. And I'm dreaming of placing my knight on E5, a central square, and exerting all kind of pressure around, including the F7 square. But he's not going to let me dream for too much. Brian will push his pawn from F7 to F6. My rook goes to E2, and I'm seriously thinking, if I reach a situation where my B2 pawn is lost, at least let's attack the pawn at E6. Brian pushes his A pawn from A5 to A4. It's coming near and nearer. And I know that soon the B pawn is lost, so let's attack the pawn at E6. He saves it with pushing his pawn from E6 to E5. And I want now to threaten the D5 pawn. There are 2 ways to do it, either with the rook from E2 going to D2 or from E1 to D1. I decided to move my rook from E1 to D1 because I don't want my rooks to be on dark-colored squared, since Brian has dark-colored bishop. In addition, if I put my rook from E2 to D2, my knight on F3 loses 2 squares where it might potentially go in the future. That's why I move my rook from E1 to D1. And Brian pushes his pawn from D5 to D4. Now the pawn is pinned, so he cannot take my pawn at C3. If he pushes it down to D3, I take it. But it's now my turn. What can I do to stop his advances? Currently, he has no passed pawn, which is good for me because this means that he will have first to create one and then promote it most of the times. But I know I cannot let it there for too long. Let it there for too long. His c pawn goes to c4, and then the d pawn can easily go to d3. Becomes protected pass pawn. That's why I first take the pawn, but now after he takes back with the c pawn, the pawn now that's at d4 becomes what's called protected pass pawn. Pass pawn means there is no opposing pawn to stop it, and protected means that I cannot take it with my pieces because it's protected by another pawn. At least let's attack it twice with my two rooks. Now it's attacked 3 times with my knight and my two rooks. So if all other fails, I could take it with my knight and I would give my knight for 2 pawns, in fact, two very crucial pawns. I would still be down material, but at least for the time being, I would stop the advance of his pawns. But Brian decides to take the advantage and grab my pawn on b2. I take back his rook, he takes back my rook. And I lost my b pawn. Second pawn I'm down. At least let's minimize the damage and save the other pawn on a2 by placing my rook on a1. His bishop goes to a3 near the center of, not the center of action, near the action, and the action is the a2 pawn. What I want to do now is bring also my knight near the action. Goes to a1. And his pawn goes to a4. If he didn't move it, my knight will go to d3, attack the rook, and perhaps slow down him a little bit more. Surprise, surprise, as I say, he saw it, his pawn goes down to e4. And now I want to bring my king near the center of action. My knight has nowhere to go. Goes to c2, lost by the rook. Goes to d3 or f3, lost by the e4 pawn. So let's bring the king near the action. And since we're approaching the ending, he wants also his king to be more active, goes to e6. I want to threaten the pawn at e4 with my pawn. f2 goes to f3. Whether he takes to not now, his d4 pawn becomes unprotected. And now whether this helps me or not, we're going to see. He defends his pawn by moving his f pawn from f6 to f5. I know that I'm already lost. What can I do? If I take the pawn, the other pawn will take it, and I have two connected pass pawns. What else can I do? My rook has nowhere to go in order not to lose the pawn. My knight has nowhere to go. If I push my g pawn, my king cannot go any nearer. I can only go further away. If I push my g pawn, I lose my f pawn. Yes, I can take it back with my knight, but my position becomes worse and worse. And by elimination, the only thing remaining is move my h pawn going to h4. King goes to e5. You see his advantage is huge. It's more than 6 pawns. Under different conditions, I might already have resigned, but since it's a free chess lesson, why not take advantage or learn as much as possible? Let's take the pawn now. We'll do again almost nothing, but in theory, if I could bring him down to just 1 pawn and keep the other pieces, there could be a chance for a draw, especially with rooks on the board. Takes back the f pawn. What else can I do now? Just by elimination, since I can move nothing else, let's move the g pawn to g4. King goes to f4, threatens my pawns. That's right, pawn g4 goes to g5. King, I was expecting his king to go to g4 and attack the h4 pawn. Instead, he pushes it even nearer the action. King goes to g3. Save my pawn to h5. His d pawn goes now to d3. Let's push his pawns, at least let's exchange instead of losing them. And his bishop from a3 goes to c5, and I knew what was going to happen. He was going to bring his rook to f2 and check, and if I didn't move my knight, king goes to g2 followed by a discover check. What else can I do out of moves? At least let's push my a pawn to a3. And as expected, because my knight can basically nowhere to go. If it get anywhere to go, would move it. So after the check, my king would go to e1. So his king goes to f2 checks, and I move my king to f1. And then he checks me from g2. And believe it or not, at the time, I only saw the rook checking, and I was ready to grab it with my knight. And I was feeling, why did he blunder so late with such a huge advantage? Let's see where he was before. According to the computer, he's 2 moves away from the mate. Let's go back and see how far we were. Even before it was, you see the M's in front of it for a long time. Let's see how long did you have mates. From the moment that I pushed my pawn from h4 to h5, it was mate in 8 moves. Let's see where we're now. Here is king is to g2, and it's 1 move from mate. On the board, I didn't see the second check because this is a double check. Both his bishop and his rook attack my king. I didn't see it. I grabbed my knight from e1, happily winning the rook on g2, and he told me it's a double check. Then I realized what was the case. And then I started checking, where can my king go? Only 2 legal moves, f1 or h1, either of them, g1 is made. And that's why at this moment I resigned. And Brian, congratulations once again for your win. And thanks for the nice comments you had about our channel. It's wonderful when you see a player rated above 2000 having such nice comments about grecochess. No surprise, Brian wins again. And let's review. Let's see what the computer thinks about this game. Brian had accuracy of 93.9, I was 78.9. What would the ratings be? For me, the 2000 is quite nice and quite flattering. No objection with that, although I know that these numbers are not to be trusted. And Brian had, his game's rating was 2500. Let's go to the individuals. Brian had a brilliant move. I believe it was when his knight took my pawn on e5 and gave the 1 pawn advantage. Had one great move. Best moves. Both of us had 5 book moves. Best moves. I had 8 versus 19. 18 excellent versus 10 of Brian. 3 good for me, 4 for Brian. And let's see the negative category. Brian had no inaccuracies, no mistakes, no misses, and no blunders, while I had 4 inaccuracies, 2 mistakes, 0 misses, and 0 blunders. This concludes my coverage of the first day of the QCC Swiss tournament. I started with a draw and a loss, but playing against extremely strong players. I consider this to be a good result. The tournament continues next Friday, June 27th. In the meantime, we'll continue facing the chess.com bots. And the next one is very special to me. I'm facing my compatriot Eleni. But for now, for the QCC Swiss tournament, Summer Swiss tournament, this was the end of covering of the first day. I am Harry Lawson. Thanks everybody for watching, and a special thanks for the people that subscribed and liked and gave some encouraging comments. This is the Greco Chess channel. Goodbye.